So today I want to talk about preparing a model for external review. What I mean by this is to prepare a model to be shown on the website or on your reel or even to show off in a daily or to your boss or something like that. So not going to cover everything here, but it'll give you a general overview. So what I want to do is start with this windmill that I've created, and I want to be able to set this up so other people can take a look. So the first thing that we want to do is really our goal here is to get a quick, fast setup. Good idea to use some sort of platform or thin cylinder. So I'll go in here and just create a quick cylinder right like this. I'll scale that up and then I'll bring it down a little bit like this. And you want to make it big enough so that it can receive shadows, but that you don't overwhelm your scene, right? We don't want us to be looking at our environment and saying, "Oh wow, look at the big cylinder." We want to say, "Hey, look at the cool windmill." In this case. So I'm just going to make that just a little bit smaller, I think, right like that. That looks pretty good. And I want to make sure my little platform here looks decent here. So I'll just go in and add a little bit of an edge loop right there and an edge loop right there. And let's hit 3. We can see we've got that. Maybe even I'll add another one on the inside of this. I'll just grab all of those polygons here, right like that, and make sure I don't get anything on the side. So you see I've got the bottom and the top here. And then I'll just switch over to my scale and I'll hold down my shift key and I'll just scale this in the very smallest amount right like that. Right, great. Let's get out of that. We can see if we hit smooth, we've got a nice little platform right like that. Excellent. Then what we want to do is set up our lighting, right? And I'm going to use Arnold in this example, but I have used Redshift. I've done Mental Ray in the past. It really works with any one of those, as long as you know what the render settings and those kinds of things are. So let's add an Arnold area light. So we're going to click in the Arnold tab here and grab an Arnold light, scale it up a little bit, bring it back here. And really the position of this first light is what's going to determine our shadows. So I will maybe bring this, something like over here, bring it like that, and rotate it pretty sharply down, something like that. And then bring it up and over my object. We'll say like that. And now realize that the size of this will determine the softness of the shadows as well. So I'm going to make this actually a little smaller to get a little bit crisper types of shadows. All right, so let's take a look at this as a render. And we'll click on the Arnold renderer button here. You can see we're not getting much. The reason is because it's way too dark. Our light is not giving off enough light here. So let's increase the exposure value to 10. Right, still not enough. Let's try 20. Hey, there we go. Right, we're getting some results there. And let's try 24. A little bit too bright. So let's try 23. All right, we'll go with that. It's going to be a little brighter up here, but we can always bring that up a little bit. Now, I'm not trying to mimic sunlight, right? If I was going to do that, I would use the sun shader. I'm trying to illuminate as if my object is just sort of being shown off, right? We're just trying to do a little object, just to show it off here, just almost like studio lighting or something like that. So let's render that again because I moved it away. And you'll see it got a little darker, all right? But let's go with that, right? So I'll take that, and let's create another light. Scale that up. Let's bring it over here. And let's create a bit of a fill light. We're going to leave this one nice and big. Maybe pull it up a bit. Something like that. Aim it just a little bit more in there. And let's take a look at what that looks like. And we'll hit render. All right, remember, the exposure is still super, super low, right? So we want to make sure we include that, right? So let's bring that up to 20. See, now we're getting some nice lighting on this side. All right, let's go ahead and increase that to 22. Cool, a little bright, but we're going to add just a little bit of color to this. All right, so let's click on this. Let's just stop that for a second. We'll click on this and add just a little bit of blue. Not a lot, just a little bit, maybe desaturate it just a little bit right like that. And we'll kick that off and see we're getting some nice blue there. Still a little dark, right? So let's bring that up to maybe 23, right? That's a bit better. Maybe a lighter blue. Just go into a little bit desaturated there. And that's looking pretty good. All right. Now, we still have some pretty dark shadows here. We're getting some secondary shadows. Let's deal with the secondary shadows. I'm going to take this same light that we have over here, and I'm going to turn off the shadows, right? So we're going to do that, and let's kick that render off. You'll see that that cleaned that up quite a bit there. We're still getting some dark shadows here, but it's looking a little bit better. Let's close that. Now, we also want to take a look, what does it look like behind, right? Because we're going to do, a 360 rotation possibly of this. We want to make sure it looks good from all angles. You see, that's very, very dark. So we have a couple of options. One is that we could add, one or two more lights, area lights in here. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to add the sky dome light. All right, so let's add that in. So we'll create that, creates a big sphere here. We'll open this up super big, right like that, so it's out of our way. And let's see what happens when we render this. It's like, whoa, crazy amount of light, right? It's almost blasted out our other lighting here. We've also got this sort of nasty white background that we don't want anymore. So let's get rid of some of this stuff, right? So it's way too bright too. So let's take first and get rid of that background. So I'm going to go into my light settings here, and in the visibility camera, instead of a 1, I'm going to put that at a 0. And watch when I render that, you can see this goes away, the black comes back. Excellent. Got that. We'll close that out. Still too bright. Now, the sky dome does have an exposure, but I typically will use the intensity on that. Let's drop that down to maybe about 0.25 and do a little render. And like, oh, look at that. Looking good. We've got our shadows in there from the one light, but also a little bit of secondary shadows from our sky dome. Let's just pause that for a minute, rotate around here, right like this. Look at the back. Remember last time this was super, super dark, and now, oh, look, it is got some illumination to it. So we can add some tinting to this. If you wanted to add like an HDR image or something like that, you could totally do that into this image. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to stick with the white for right now. What I will often do, though, is do like a simple HDR image in here, like a sky or something like that, just to get a little bit of color. I'm going to take this guy over here that's giving me a little bit of the blue here. I'm going to increase that just a little bit more. Let's try 24. And then with my top area light here, okay, that top area light, let's tint that just a little yellow, right? Not very much. You can see I'm very low on that saturation scale. And let's see what that's going to look like now with those three lighting. So you can see I've got a little bit of the yellow in there. That's probably a little bit too much, but I've got a little bit of the blue tint. So let's bring that yellow down even more. And yeah, just a small amount. That looks much, much better. And again, up to you, but we don't want to use super strong colors here. All right, great. Let's take a look at creating some turntables then. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is change the timeline length. You can see I have my timeline set here to 120 frames, right like that. You can always change those values right in here and type those in. I've already got mine set. Then what we want to do is create an object that is like the center of what we want to look at. And this is really, really important because we don't want our turntable to wobble at all. Now, some objects, like this object or any of these objects in here, are really centered on my grid point and centered on my platform here. But I wouldn't want, say, for example, to choose this object and rotate around that. So sometimes you have a sort of asymmetrical or lopsided object in some way, and it can be super helpful to create just a simple object. I'm going to just create a little sphere here, and I'll make that a little bigger, right like that. And I'm just going to sort of put that in here for right now, and we'll just even make that a little bigger, something like that. Obviously not a big part of our scene, but we want to, that's what we're going to sort of do our focus around. The next thing that we want to do is go into our render settings here, and we want to make sure that we're rendering at the right size here. So we've got HD 1080. That's the one that we're looking for here, is we're going to go with that. That's going to give me a decent size to render, nice quality. If I want to shrink it down a little bit, it won't hurt too much. All right, so that there, we'll change our camera settings and all that kind of stuff a little bit later. All right, what I want to do is be able to see what my camera is going to see here. So I'm going to turn on this little button right here, and it gives me my little resolution window, so I can see. You can see there's the 1920 by 1080. Now, what I want to do is frame this well. I'll use my Alt and my right mouse button to zoom in a little bit. I don't want to have no space, but I want to make sure I have a good amount. And I always do like a little test Arnold render here, see how this looks. All right, let's make sure we pull back. There we go. A little bit more space, I think. So I'll just zoom this back just a tad. Oh, I went the wrong way. Let's turn that off for a second. Let's go right about there, maybe. And we will take a look at that. I like the framing of that. And so now, again, making sure I have this sort of center object. It could be part of your model. It may be a dummy object like mine is. I'm going to have that object selected. I'm going to switch this over into animation right here. I'm going to go into visualize, and then I'm going to say create turntable. And if you want to, you can go into the settings. Really, it's the amount of frames you want it to rotate. I'm going to do 120 right there. And then I don't really care which direction it rotates. I most of the time have it go clockwise there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. Now, let's see what happened when we did that. First of all, you'll notice I'm no longer in a perspective view. I'm in a camera view. Second, we'll notice that a group has been made here, and that group has a camera in it. Very important. Right, let's take this sphere. We actually don't need that anymore. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Now, let's hit play and see what we have. So we're rotating around our object here. Now, we still have some problems. Our problem here is that we're getting this ease out and ease in with our turntable. So let's stop this. And let's make sure that we can fix this. We're going to go into our windows, and we're going to go into our graph editor for animation right there. Okay, and it's going to show our keyframes for what the object is. Now, a very common mistake that I see people make is they look on the turntable, they don't see any animation or anything, and they give up. Right? We don't want to give up. We want to make sure that we're on this group. There's our animation, right? So we're going to select all of that, and we're just going to make that linear. I'll use that there. So now take a look. If I close this out and I hit play, as I play this, decent speed, and when I get to the end, it just loops right around. That's perfect. So I like that a lot. So what's our next step? Well, we want to render all of this out, right? And before we render it out, we want to make sure our render settings are correct. So let's take a look at those render settings right now. All right, so in my common tab here, I want to make sure, first of all, I want to give it a name, right? So, I'll call this maybe my, we'll call it windmill, and we're going to call this textured, or something like that. I really like to use the EXR format, so I'm going to leave it at that. It's a nice high quality format, very industry standard type of format there. Everything else I'm going to leave here the same. I am going to change my frame/animation extension here, and the one I like to use is this. The important thing is don't use these first two. Right, we're rendering out a sequence, we're not rendering out a single frame. So we want to make sure we choose one of these guys here. So I like to choose this one. And then how many frames are we rendering? Well, we're rendering 120, right? From start frame to 120. That's it right there. Which camera are we rendering? I don't need this perspective camera anymore. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I am definitely rendering the turntable camera. And we've got our settings for the HD 1080 right there. That's perfect. Now, another thing that you'll want to change, right, perhaps, is some of your Arnold settings. Now, that's a bit beyond this demo, but these can control like the quality of your shadows and things like that. You can also go into your lights and change the samples of those, and those will increase the quality of the lights and the shadows and that kind of thing as well. All right, so we are ready to render. So what do we want to do? Well, we're going to go up and switch this to rendering, and then we're going to go to render, and we're going to go to render sequence. I like to hit the little settings here to see what's going on. Make sure that you've got that turntable selected there. If you didn't want to save it in your project folder and you wanted to save it somewhere else, you can go ahead and put that in there. By default, it's going to save it in that images folder of the project folder. I like to keep it there. It stays nice and organized. So then what do? We go ahead and hit render and render that out. So what exactly do we want to render, right? That's a big question. We want to render out at least 3, possibly 4 different types of renders. We want to render out, if we're doing like a high poly and a low poly model version, like if we're trying to show off our game modeling skills, maybe you'd first render out your textured super high poly model, with all the cool textures on it and everything like that. Right? Great, one render done. Then do a quick save as, right? Do a quick save as, swap out your textures, really just take off all of the textures and just make sure your model is grays. Some people will go with more of a clay, sort of light brown, but I prefer the gray. Do that with the high poly model, no textures on there, just render it straight out. Then what you're going to do is swap out that high poly model, right? Swap out that high poly model, bring in your low poly model. This one's got all your cool textures on there, especially those textures that you've transferred from your high poly to your low poly. Things like your normal maps. Maybe you've got ambient occlusion maps on there. Maybe you have a displacement map, anything like that that you're using to run your low poly model. Render that out and make it look super awesome, right? All of these lighting sequences will work exactly the same. The same render rotation, everything is the same because the model is centered, our camera's moving around it, it's going to look great. Another one that you could do, another save as, is a wireframe render. Look into Arnold. Arnold has a Arnold wireframe shader. So does Redshift. Um, do it slightly different with Mental Ray, but they all can be found. Render that out. Great. That's perfect. You end up with some very, very cool rotations. Now, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to render my windmill here, but what if we wanted to get like a work in progress or a wireframe model um, really, really fast without wanting to get to wait out for a really long render? We can still do that here. So if we're back in Maya here, we'll go ahead and close our render sequence. And what we're going to do is create a Playblast, right? Now, again, if you wanted to have your textures on there, you could leave your textures on there. Um, Typically for a work in progress type of model, I am not going to do that. I'm going to just make sure I have just the shaded mode. So really what I'm talking about is not going into this mode. I can't see anything there. I'm going to make sure I'm in this mode. If you do have textures, you can render those if you want, but I'm going to leave it at 5, right? Show my shaded display on. Then, team, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide everything that I don't want in that scene. For example, I don't want the um, that sky dome in there. I'm not going to want these area lights. I'm just hitting H to hide those out, right? Maybe I don't even want my grid in there, so I'll just hide that out. You can see, wow, that still looks pretty decent. I can still render that out. Shows me a nice wireframe. Excellent. Right, to create that Playblast, we're going to go right up here into Windows and click on Playblast. We'll go ahead and click on the settings here. Got the time slider. That's exactly what we want, right? Frame 1 to 120. That's perfect. We want to render the view that we're in. Format. I like to stick with QuickTime. You could choose AVI or even an image sequence. I'll stick with QuickTime for this. We've got our encoding. Can do MPEG-4, H.264, really anything. I would just avoid animation. Tends to make a really bloated file. Make sure your quality's at 100%. I'm going to choose my size for my render settings, so it uses that HD 1080, but you could definitely set a custom or from a Windows setting. Make sure the scale is a 1-for-1, right? We want to get that full size from the 1080. Going to go ahead and click on Save Files, and I'm putting in a movie file name right there. And you see I've already done that, but I could hit Browse, and I could rename this, Windmill, WYP2, something like that, and hit Save. And we'll go ahead and hit the Playblast. You'll see this makes this really, really fast. And then it picks it up for me. You can see right there it's playing that. Right, great. And it restarts through, goes all the way through, and got a little bit of a blip going on there with my Windows Media Player. Let me see if that exists actually in the file itself. I don't think it does, but let's check. And you see there it goes. It's playing well. No blips or anything like that. Right? Excellent. Hope this was fun for you, and I'll see you next time.